We were working on a hospital compound. We were fixing a water filtration system, and there was a guy that would always beg outside of the gates of the hospital compound that he had polio when he was a kid, and he spent the rest of his life just dragging himself on the ground. Didn't have money for a wheelchair. A simple vaccine would have fixed it when he was a kid, and it was just like I just couldn't kind of rationalize like why is this guy's life like this? Like this seems like a simple thing that we could have fixed.
Most Podern 팟캐스트.
We're going to get back to the episode in just 1 second, but if you happen to be in Houston, please check out An Endless War, a photo exhibit by Every Shelter featuring the work of war photojournalist Moses Sawasawa. It's really a great opportunity to see the impact of Scott's work, and details are in the show notes below. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Today, on the Most Podern podcast, we're joined by our good friend, Scott Key, CEO and co-founder of Every Shelter, an organization that's rethinking what it means to provide safety and dignity for displaced communities around the world. With a background in architecture, product design, and construction, Scott has spent the last decade turning innovative ideas into life-changing solutions for those who need them most. I can count the number of designers that have had as much impact as Scott on one finger. So it's an incredible joy to welcome Scott to the show. Welcome, Scott.
That's super nice of you. Thank you for having me.
Where does this podcast find you today?
We are in our temporary offices in a little church in Houston, Texas. We are across the street from our future forever home.
Yeah, we met in Houston in Architecture Studio. When I was drinking beer, you were coming up with great ideas. Can you give us the backstory of what started as Emergency Floor? Where'd you come up with the idea? How did you get funding for the idea? And where did you take it?
So we met at Rice University School of Architecture, and Sam Brizendine, my co-founder, and I were both grad students, and we were in a program called Rice Building Workshop, which is now Construct. And the project started out as a disaster relief project. Some students had gotten some grant funding. They had both graduated. One of them went on preceptorship, and we needed to build the thing that they designed. The thing they designed, you couldn't build for the amount of money they had, and so Sam and I redesigned it. And it was a box that turned into a floor. Everything in the box turned into a shelter and all the things you would need in that shelter. We ended up taking that to a disaster relief conference and got a lot of feedback that what we had done was really bad. And we had some people give us feedback that there was a need for flooring internationally in the humanitarian space. And that was a really curious thing for us, because I think the context that we had was like, what do you mean there's a need for flooring in the humanitarian world? That led us down a rabbit hole of the refugee space. We learned that refugees stay displaced for about 20 years on average. That was a lot longer than we thought. And when we learned they lived in the dirt, we were moved by that. At the time, the Syrian conflict was a few years in. We started reading stories about refugees freezing to death in the middle of the night. And that was really our jumping off point for, hey, we're really going to focus on refugees. We want to create a solution where refugees don't freeze to death in the middle of the night. That was the origin of that. We pursued it as grad students. Right as Sam and I finished grad school, we landed a grant with USAID, specifically a group within USAID called Developing Innovative Ventures. Most grant funding is really bread and butter. This was a more risk-taking form of funding, and it allowed us to take what we had developed as students as a prototype and start working with Syrian families on the Lebanese border under the UN High Commissioner for Refugees umbrella. So that was really our origin point. They gave us a grant that seemed impossibly large to us at the time. It still wasn't enough money to live off of. So Sam and I both got jobs. He was an architect. I was the director of product design at the company. And we would just take a ton of unpaid time off, and we would oversee this pilot of our floors in Lebanon for the next couple years.
So take us down this rabbit hole. Like, why flooring? Why wasn't this something that was already solved before?
Yeah, and why insulated flooring? Maybe I'd augment the question. Refugees historically had lived in warmer places. So the UN High Commissioner for Refugees origin is in the 1950s. And over the course of their time, they transitioned from being a resettlement agency to a group that ultimately ended up running refugee camps, as we know them. During that transition, most of those refugees lived in warm places. And so when we found ourselves with Afghan refugees, with Syrian refugees living in cold places, they really didn't have great answers for keeping them warm. So you saw a lot of really clumsy solutions around insulating. I mean, imagine insulating a tent, right? As an architect, that's a pretty difficult thing to do. It's an expensive thing to do. They're bulky to ship. Insulation's bulky by nature to ship. So for us, having cold weather camped, the floor was the obvious place to start. If you're going to insulate something, insulate one surface, that would be the ground. When it's cold outside, we're like, oh, the air is cold. If you've ever laid on a cold surface, you know that your body and the cold ground are trying to reach thermal equilibrium. And so that was just really our instinct was, hey, if we can insulate the ground, it's great if you can insulate the whole tent, but as long as you can insulate the ground, like a family's going to be way better off. So we spent a lot of our time actually, monitoring that premise. We part of our grant funding was setting up 2 identical shelters, installing a bunch of monitoring equipment inside of each, and monitoring the temperature at the ground level, at 3 feet up, at 5 feet up, and just averaging those temperatures. And what we found through that, and then which was then validated in the field with a bunch of families, was that it in fact does keep you warmer. It makes a thermal break. It keeps basically the first 3 feet of your shelter quite warm. We know, historically speaking, that refugees spend about 17 hours on the ground in their shelter. They don't have furniture. So you're really keeping heat where the families are. And so, yeah, that's why floors, and that's why insulated floors. It's not good for you health-wise to live in the dirt. I think that is a pretty easy thing to say. Kids suffer from higher levels of diarrhea, parasitic infections. If you don't have a clean environment, especially children will introduce things, by having dirty hands. And so from a hypothermia standpoint, it's really important. From a health standpoint, on an ongoing basis, it's really important to have a floor. It's something that we take for granted. Almost no refugee has a floor. Something like 2 billion people across the globe don't have clean floors.
Scott, it's wonderful to see you again after all these years. We were classmates with Lebo and you 10 years ago at Rice. And one thing that strikes me as profoundly inspirational is that a lot of people want to take their design degree and do something good with it, benefit the world. Now, you were able to do that early in your career. Was that something going into architecture school and going through training that you wanted to do from the beginning?
Yeah, I didn't know what it was going to look like, but I remember telling my dad when I was quitting my job in construction and going back to architecture school, I was like, man, I want to do something humanitarian with this. And he was just like, man, that's not a thing. That's not like a job you can go get. And he was definitely right. But yeah, I had spent, when I was 18, I had spent a good chunk of my summer before I started my freshman year of college in Nigeria. And that was the first time I'd left the country. And that was a pretty important, experience in my life. I saw things that kind of stretched my kind of U.S. context in ways that I just didn't understand why the world was the way it was and why things were worse there. So by the time
tell us more about that. Like, what did you see there? What was that experience like for you?
You go from like just a middle class U.S. context, and then you go to a rural Nigerian area, and you see poverty at pretty extreme levels. I think the thing that always stood out to me was there was a guy we were working on a hospital compound. We were fixing a water filtration system, and there was a guy that would always beg outside of the gates of the hospital compound that he had polio when he was a kid. And he spent the rest of his life just dragging himself on the ground. Didn't have money for a wheelchair. A simple vaccine would have fixed it when he was a kid. And it was just like, I just couldn't kind of rationalize, like, why is this guy's life like this? Like, this seems like a simple thing that we could have fixed. It was my first, I guess that's maybe the most pronounced experience in that time, where it was just sort of like, man, like, we live in such a wealthy country. Like, why can't we fix this stuff? Why does anybody have to experience this? And I'm not drawn to medicine. That was not my path. I was always really attracted to buildings and design. And so when I went to school for architecture, I was just like, hey, I'm going to do something cool with this, something humanitarian. But I had no idea what that looked like. I figured I'd probably end up just being a professor, not just being a professor. Being a professor is great for any professors out there. I would have loved to have been a professor, and I thought that's probably what it would be, working on design build projects with students. I was definitely very taken by rural studio, but I didn't know what the other end of this was going to look like. And so I was pretty attracted to rice building workshop just as a kind of a practical application of design and doing something good. But I had no idea that project would kind of take us all the way to where we are as Every Shelter.
But you did find that, right? You came in with this goal, you didn't know where it was leading, but it seems like looking backwards, connecting the dots, you did take every step in order to get there. But it's one thing to have a design, it's one thing to have a solution, but it's another thing to actually implement it, to actually be able to help people with what you've designed. So what was that first moment with the emergency floor when you looked at something that you've built and you're like, wow, this is really working?
Yeah, I mean, so when we were still students, we heard that IKEA was funding a group that was developing a flat pack refugee shelter. And everything that we could find online, they were struggling to figure out a flooring system for that. And so we used our fancy architecture school skills, and we photoshopped our floor into their shelter. And we just sent it to their info at. And they emailed us back and invited us to test it out in Sweden. And wow. So, that happened while we were still grad students. And so it propelled us from two dudes who no one would call back to, these guys worked with Better Shelter, IKEA. We had a picture of our floor end up in the New York Times, and they were really generous with us with introductions because, I mean, they came at it from a very different standpoint. I mean, still design, but they had $54 million over time and 8 years of development time. And it was Scott and Sam have never had that much money, and we were definitely bootstrapping. But they were really generous with their introductions. I mean, They lent us a lot of credibility, made some pretty key introductions. I feel fairly confident that that's ultimately what helped us land the USAID grant when we finished. But so that was one of the moments. I remember the first time we saw our mold. We injection mold our floors because we still manufacture the floors today, same floor. But I remember seeing that mold for the first time and just being like, dude, this is legit. Like, we're gonna we can make so many floors with this. And then I'd say one other moment was just, I think the first time that we had an order, I'm trying to think of how many tiles we did. It was like 20,000 tiles, and just seeing them stacked in this warehouse in Lebanon, it was just a mountain of floors, and it was just going to, the next day it was going to start going out to families, and it was just like, man, we're doing something. Over time we've done over 1 million square feet of flooring. So looking back on it now is just sort of, it's surreal that like the intentions that we had as students, kind of manifested, and obviously didn't happen accidentally. It's been a lot of work, but there's lots of moments along the way that we were pretty confident we can't take credit for. I mean, plenty of work, but just a lot of moments where it's like, man, that wasn't us that did this. This, wasn't the fruit of our labor.
I think what you describe is that sense of pride that a lot of architects have when they see their work imagined, see it actually manifested, actually.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about your product is that it's something that moves pretty quickly and gets deployed extremely quickly. That being said, I'm sure there's also a lot of growing pains entering into a field of, I don't even know what to call it, construction, response aid. Like, it's a very nebulous sort of domain that I don't think architecture school prepares you for. So what was that like, entering into the world of refugee camps and foreign aid and that sort of thing as a newly graduated student?
Yeah. I mean, I think I know that our first notion when we finished and we had one product that seemed like it was doing really well was that we were going to be product designers for the refugee shelter sector, if you want to call it that. I mean, even the first time you're in a refugee camp, if you're an architect, you're just like, man, there's a lot of stuff to fix here, right? Like, you see problems, you see deficiencies, constantly. We had a vision for being product designers in this space. And, we always talk about the time in Lebanon. We worked in Lebanon from 2015 to 2020. And that was our real education. It was where we saw like the sector, the refugee relief sector fully. We started kind of like, it started taking a form and a shape, and we started understanding the organization of it while we were there. We had always imagined that we would just design these floors, these solutions, prove them out, and that there'd be some mechanism within that system that would scale it for us. It's like, hey, I don't know how to scale it. Y'all do. I don't know how to do that, but we can keep churning out these solutions. It wasn't that easy, as you can imagine. And there weren't mechanisms for that. And like, you would see a UN catalog full of the shelter goods, and none of them were new or innovative. The newest one was like, I think the most recent innovation was from the early 70s. And you started to see like, hey, actually all of the companies that are represented in this catalog, there's only 3 of them. And they've been the same kind of entrenched vendors for decades. And, so the more time we spent in the system, it was like, man, this is super broken. This isn't like, the reason refugees are sleeping in the dirt isn't because there's not good ideas out there. They exist in a system that was never designed for them to be displaced for 20 years would be one way to say it. But there weren't a lot of incentives in that system to change and to do better. And, I can kind of talk on and on about one-year grant cycles and how short-sighted that makes decision makings. And yeah,
Well, talking about systems, I mean, I'm also an international looking at this, and I have no clue how it works. So can you just tell us on a very high level how USAID works?
yeah. So USAID spans a lot of different sectors within what we would call humanitarianism, right? And so the specific subsection that every shelter is focused on is refugees, displacement, and it is very niche. It's very specialized. I say very niche. There's 122 million people displaced right now, right? And actually, just to take a moment with that, from the time that Sam and I started this work in 2012, that number is almost doubled. So it is growing. It is growing rapidly. But that being said, the bulk of USAID's focus is not refugees. There's a subsection within USAID called the Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration, and they are the ones that are. So take that big $54 million budget, and then subsection some portion of that off, and that's the refugee side of it. But to answer your question, generally speaking, globally, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is the gatekeeper, is the coordinating body for refugee relief. It gets really complicated. If somebody doesn't cross a border, they're not a refugee. Now it's IOM. If somebody's fleeing from a perceived, for monetary reasons, that they want a better opportunity, now they're also not a refugee. That's a different group as well. So, I mean, it's sort of an alphabet soup of bureaucracies often. But so generally speaking, to answer your question, the UNHCR is setting priorities globally. They're trying to take a global view. In the field, the most interaction you see with the UNHCR with refugees hands-on is registration. At a larger geopolitical level, the biggest utility that they provide is negotiating the rights for the refugees to be there. There's not a lot of universal truths in the refugee sector, but one is that there's almost no countries on earth that want to host refugees. So one of the biggest utilities that the UN plays is to basically negotiate those rights and say, hey, we're going to try to basically strike the best deal we can for these people who are coming in and create as much preserve as many rights as we possibly can for them.
What does a deal like that look like? Like, does the UN guarantee funding? Like, is the UN renting the land for the refugees? How does that negotiation go about?
Every country's different, and it comes down to the country. So I can speak to the ones where we have experience. So when we were working in Lebanon, it was the Ministry of Social Affairs within the Lebanese government that was really kind of setting the terms. Lebanon's government has gone through a lot of transition, obviously, in the last year. But has never really been a fully kind of functional entity. But, at the height of the Syrian war, there were 4 million Lebanese, 1.8 million Syrians in Lebanon. So almost a third of the population were refugees, right? And so that puts a little bit of color on countries that are hosting refugees. I mean, it can be quite overwhelming, the number of people who come in. So in that case, Lebanon, having had a history with Palestinians in southern Lebanon especially, had no desire for formal camps to be established. So refugees were effectively on their own, but the Lebanese military never wanted more than 40 shelters to be in a single place. So there were no camps. This is what you would call informal settlements. So the moment you left Beirut, you would just see pockets of shelters, kind of scattered all over the place. That multiplying out to 1.8 million refugees. I mean, it was kind of chaotic, in some senses. So every refugee was effectively negotiating land rights with a landlord. Obviously, that led to a lot of exploitation, especially around labor. But it was just really chaotic. But that was what the Lebanese government wanted. They didn't want anybody to get too comfortable. And so in Uganda, where we work, it's quite different. The government is very generous by global standards with refugees. Mm-hmm. There's 14 different refugee settlements. We call them settlements, not camps there, because there's a notion that there can be some investments made that are more permanent in these places. But the government runs the camps. The government is quite involved and by global standards, quite generous. I could kind of keep going down the list, but it really varies country by country, like how that gets negotiated. Jordan's refugee camps, I'll just say this, a lot of countries where I've been, their camps look and feel a lot like minimum security prisons. You can't come and go. There's barbed wire. The only way you leave is if a Jordanian checks you out. That was the case in camps in Iraq that I've been to. But often refugee camps are geographically pretty isolated. So even if you didn't have fencing, it's just really difficult to get to a population center.
Some of these camps or settlements, as some people refer to them, you're saying, are at the scale of a small town or a small city.
Yeah.
Do these organizations who run and manage them have anybody on staff who are dealing with the planning, the implementation, basically the spatial configuration of these places, architects, planners, etc.?
Yeah, yes. And there's an ideal, there's a standard, there's like a, like a residential code or commercial code like we have in the States. I mean, there's something called the Sphere Manual that dictates some of that. That being said, that's the ideal. When you have a million people who cross all at the same time, it's quite chaotic. So, like in the case of Uganda, it is quite organized. They have 14 settlements. They have room for expansion. So we're seeing a lot of refugees coming in, about 500,000 in the last 12 months that have come in from the DRC into Uganda. There's a process. They get a plot of land. That being said, there's not a lot of infrastructure. So it is organized. There's some planning behind it, but they're really not being serviced with anything like sewage, electrical, anything like that. Camps that we've been in Iraq. I was in a camp one time that was just one of the most horrible places that I've ever been. But down the road, they were trying to achieve the ideal, and they were slowly transitioning people over to something that had a bit more infrastructure that was more suited, I guess, towards having a large population. But you're right to say that they're the size of small towns. I mean, the camp that we work in the north at its peak was 270,000 people in one camp, right? One settlement. The camp where we're in,
That's like
the
the size
south
of
of
Pittsburgh.
Uganda. Yeah, it's huge. I mean, I grew up in a town of 14,000 people. Even a camp of 14,000 people is a lot of people. So the camp in the south where we're working has grown from 120 to 220,000 people in the last 12 months. So there's a lot of folks, living in these places.
Seems like there's a lot of complexity. The rules are different in every country. Each refugee group's situation is slightly different. The climate is different. And you have to navigate this huge international ecosystem of aid and negotiations. So, you've been at this for a decade. You must have somehow figured out how to work within this system. What was that first moment you graduated from, hey, I'm a grad student trying to do something good in the world, to, hey, I'm actually someone who can navigate the system and really make the system work for me?
Yeah, the origin of it was having a very successful first product. I mean, for us, it built up a lot of credibility. I mean, we had partners that would implement our floors, and they were just like, man, this is amazing. This is a really simple intervention that gets us so much of it, so much in terms of the family's livelihood, well-being, et cetera. So one of those partners ended up becoming pretty fundamental to us being able to navigate the system. I mean, they see it. We haven't really gotten into this, but they see the same problems that we saw in the system, especially as it related to the physical lives of refugees. And they were like, hey, look, you guys can do the things that we want to do. It's just hard for us to do them because we're huge, right? We're a huge organization. And so they are the ones who brought us to Uganda. They brought us into other contexts, and they essentially provided an umbrella over us in our early days of operating. So it was a major NGO, a part of that system, who recognized the problems, that said, hey, look, we want you to come alongside of us and help us do things in a different way, effectively. So we've been working with them for the last 6 years. We launched some of our hardware stores with them. Now in Uganda, we're independent. We have our own charitable status, but we still choose to partner with them. I mean, part of that is our vision of scale. It's like when we create something, we don't want to operationalize across 20 countries. We do see value in the existing actors in this, taking the things that we've built and then spreading them across their platform. So yeah, we never have a vision of being huge. We see ourselves a little bit more in an R&D role. I think I spent many years kind of shaking my fist at the system. And I think, I don't think that was very productive, honestly. I think we've found really productive ways of working within the system and saying like, hey, if I can build A, which is a great substitution for B, and then I can introduce A into that system, that's a much better way for us to be scaling an impact than, just being angry at why things don't work very well, because they don't work very well.
I think you dropped a little hint there with the hardware store, which is where I think we want to go next. Is one thing that I find really admirable watching the evolution of Emergency Floor to Every Shelter is that you've gone from a product approach to a whole systems approach. So what is the motivation behind that? Why did you find that you maybe needed to create a whole series of products, a whole ecosystem around what you're doing in order to produce the effect?
Yeah, and I'll take it one step further. Like our thesis is that, hey, if a refugee is displaced for multiple decades, we need to be investing in the places where they are. So we started in Uganda with the most distributed non-food item, which is the tarp. And we started out in Uganda saying, hey, could we not make this overseas? Could we make this here? The UNHCR's tarp lasts 3 to 6 months. Can we make it more durable? It's when it deteriorates 3 to 6 months after its use, we call it future trash. It can't be recycled. There's no waste management system in these places that can recycle these things. So we said, can we make it here instead of there? Can we make it more durable? Can we employ refugees in the process? And can we make it sustainable? And so we had already been experimenting with an upcycled plastic vinyl. And so that was our start. We said, hey, let's take one product, the most important product, let's make it in this place. And that was a great launching off point for us in Uganda. The systems approach, the hardware stores that you're alluding to, typically in the system, when you're innovating a new product, it starts in Geneva. You are working at a very high level with UN, if you even have that level of access. And you might spend 5 to 10 years in meetings developing this before a refugee touches it in the first place. When we had the idea for our hardware stores, I mean, there's a number of layers to the why behind the hardware store, but it gave us once we got the hardware stores in place, it became almost like a Trojan horse of sense. Like, I can put anything in that store. We can innovate directly with refugees and then have our own distribution system within the camp for that thing. Instead of starting at a boardroom level in Geneva, we can innovate with refugees in that place and then have our own distribution method kind of built into it. And so that was one aspect of the origin of the store. The other is in-kind aid. When I, say I have a truck full of blankets, and I can see your blanket, Lebo, behind you. But say I have a truckload of blanket, and you've got, tens of thousands of refugees, right? And I'm here, I'm the blanket guy, and I'm going to distribute all these things. It's like, well, hey, I already have a blanket. Actually, I have a different need, right? If you multiply that out and you say there's a camp of 220,000 people, if I said, hey, everybody has different needs, you'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. So why do we treat people's needs the same? And so one of the origin kind of concepts behind the hardware store is like, hey, let's just give people choice. Actually, that's probably more effective. They understand their needs better than we do. These are places that are often quite far from other marketplaces where there'd be a variety of choices. Let's just make that choice and agency available to these people. And has proven to be a very good idea.
Yeah, so the flexibility, in addition to that, what makes a good shelter? Can you break down?
Yeah, what makes a good shelter? Yeah, man, your view changes the longer you kind of stay in this of like what a good home is. So I'll just describe. So we're working in the northern part of Uganda, almost all the way to the border of South Sudan, and they have such a unique housing typology that they've likely been making for hundreds of years. Like, it's kind of architecture without architects. It is called, outsiders call it the tukul, but if I told you to close your eyes and imagine African hut, it'd probably be that. Really steep pitch, grass roof, often cylindrical or square footprint. It would be easy to look at that and just be like, oh, okay, great. But when you actually spend time analyzing this, we actually have a booklet on our website that really just celebrates this thing. It's a really successful building. For less than $200, spent from the family, they can have a building that works extremely well in that climate. The steep pitch roof matched with the top of the wall is actually crenellated. So like imagine like a castle, the top of a castle that you might draw as a kid. If you walk in there, you actually watch air drafting because the hot air is moving up and there's room for natural kind of convection to happen. So air is being drawn in. The grass roof provides a great thermal mass. The mud brick walls also provide a great thermal mass. You walk inside of this, and this is a pretty hot place, it's 5 to 10 degrees cooler inside than it is outside. Well, we don't need to do anything to that thing, right? That's a successful building. Like, what's the architect? What is the humanitarian designers like kind of role in this thing? Well, in this case, they couldn't get grass anymore. They couldn't get the eucalyptus poles that they were building with their structure. You've got 270,000 people at the peak, all needing the same resources. They just go away. You don't have them anymore. And so our intervention with that, talk about our role in that, is we found a local refugee-led organization that was teaching people how to make roofs out of palm leaves. Grass needs to be replaced, a couple times a year. The palm leaves are lasting 5+ years, and they were teaching people how to do this. We said, hey, that's amazing. This is a local resource, also free, can be collected. We found another organization, a nonprofit led by Ugandans that was growing bamboo poles as a replacement for eucalyptus poles, rapidly growing, obviously. And so we built a model home where we basically took the things that were problematic, mostly from a supply chain standpoint, and we said, hey, we call it Tukul 2.0. This is a Tukul. This looks exactly like what you grew. We're just making specific substitutions that are addressing like a material scarcity issue here. There's nothing that needs to be changed about this building otherwise. This is a great building. We're in other parts of the camp where other parts of the country in camps where every refugee generally starts out with 2 tarps and some poles. That's it. They're building, in the South, they're building something that looks sort of like a Quonset hut, kind of that upside down U with their tarps. And they basically take really small sticks, tie them together, and then bend them into a U shape. That is not a successful shelter. The UN tarp's going to deteriorate in 3 to 6 months. And there's an ideal standard that I think we can have as outsiders. And then how we, maybe finally to answer your question, what we define as a good shelter is like, what does the family want? We spend a lot of time just trying to understand like what it is that they think a good home is. And then we want to help them achieve that thing. So in the case of Congolese refugees coming to the Naki Valley refugee settlement, that may not look like something that you and I would define as a good home, but this is something that they're very proud of and that they're happy in. And so, we help them build mud brick homes. We prefer them to use the tarps that we make, but we're trying to help them achieve the actual housing that they desire to have. So.
I want to build on that because in many ways, what you're describing is a type of architecture that is very different from the conventional, meaning what we're trained to be architects working in cities with zoning policies and construction codes and things of that nature. At the same time, what's being revealed to me is that, in fact, you do have clients. In fact, you have a lot of clients.
Yeah.
And what you just said is you're trying to actually create a dialogue with them and try to establish some rapport so that you can help give them what they want, but also help them give what maybe they don't recognize they need or they want, and maybe supply that somehow. So my question is basically, how is that community involvement process or that client relation process, if you want to say, how does that work? And what are the obstacles to it in such a complex and messy situation like a refugee camp within an NGO bureaucratic system?
Yeah. It's an awesome question, and it's sort of at the heart of how we work. Historically, there's not been a lot of listening mechanisms, right? We see 122 million refugees across the globe. We try to reduce it to a lowest common denominator and then solve for the whole. And our approach is very much, we've got to solve problems in these places. And these places have a lot of scale. If you're worried about scale and impact of a design, places have a ton of people in them. If you solve it, you're still solving for a lot of people. So prior to us being independent, it was really hard to treat refugees as clients. You didn't have a lot of access. Not anybody can go into a refugee camp. But we have a staff of refugees in the camp who work for us. We don't do things unless there's community buy-in. And so that might look like focus group sessions. It might look like individual household surveys, interviews. But we're starting to really kind of push the boundaries with how we're listening to people. This summer, for the first time, we're going to have an actual architecture studio in the camp with refugees. And the goal of it is that the outcome of that architecture studio is to serve the community that they're in. And so we're trying to find new ways to kind of push the boundaries on what it means to listen. And we're pretty excited about that one.
So I think earlier you talked a little bit about having the NGO and other people scale this model. And one thing I want to kind of go back to is what you said about how situations are very different from country to country, from refugee group to refugee group. It seems like as you're talking about the work that you're doing in Uganda, it seems hyper-focused, hyper-local, where you need boots on the ground, really listening and responding to that need. So how do you take the model that you've established in Uganda and scale this to other places?
Yeah. Prior to USAID being dismantled, our partner was planning on taking the hardware stores to 3 different countries this year, right? Does the hardware store that leaves Uganda and goes to, say, Bangladesh, does it have the same things in it? No, it doesn't. But there's a lot of things that we learn in the process of establishing that platform that really do translate into other contexts. So that store may have different things offered, may have different trainings and services offered, but there's still kind of a baseline learning of a model that can really transpose into these other places. The architecture studio is something that we're pretty excited. What would this mean to scale? We talk about our work being community-led, expert-supported. Everybody on this call has a lot of training in the built environment, right? But we'll design the wrong things if we're not working with the community. I really do. This is the first time we're going to run it. We're going to run it a whole bunch of times before we decide if it's good or not. But if it is good, I think it will be. I would love to see a platform where architects can come into these contexts, run a 3-month studio, discover things that we're pretty inept at discovering, and then having mechanisms by which we can feed those things. And so this studio is going to be focused on...
Can you talk a little bit about that studio? And that seems really fascinating because, the studios I remember, we're trying to build concert halls or, housing on oil platforms, museums, like things that are very far from what refugees actually need. What did you imagine it to be like to run an architecture studio in a refugee camp?
We're about to find out. We have three architects who, one is from Brazil, one's from Colombia, one's from Switzerland, and then our staff architect who's at this camp is Canadian. They have all gone through a program at the University of Catalonia called the Masters of Sustainable Humanitarian Architecture, which is a thing.
Oh, wow.
And we like to recruit out of that program. So they all have VArchs or MArchs. All of them do. And in addition to that, a 2-year degree. And so we are pairing those students with refugees. We have a partner there it's a refugee-led organization called Opportunity. And the guy who runs that is a particularly creative, talented guy. I mean, he's definitely an artist at heart. Yeah, I can show you. I need to show you some pictures of some of his stuff. I mean, he's so cool. He's a cool guy. He's helping us. We've developed a selection process with him so that we can find a class of 15 architects that seem like they have some design propensity. These are likely students that haven't had any design training at all. And so that's going to be something that we probably fine tune quite a lot, is like, how do you find that class? But then we're pairing those 15 students with 4 architects. The first week we're going to spend basically teaching them how to interview their own community. The goal is to identify pain points, what's not going well. Then the class will come back basically the next week of studio and just get a top 10 list of like, hey, what did we hear? And then start ideating around, what are some possible solutions to these pain points that we heard. We'll form them into groups based on their own interests. And then those architects will play a role that's a bit of a hybrid between being a professor and also being a part of that team. So it's a little bit different than a traditional architecture studio in the sense that, like, they've had the benefit of 6, 7, 8 years of education in this. And so we want them to play not a passive role of a critic, but also a participant in teaching the students as they do with them. So the goal is that by the end, we've got maybe 3 to 5 prototypes of something that are pretty actionable. That we can take back out into the community and actually pilot the fruits of that studio. We have other programs, so we call that design. We have another program called Build, where we're literally training people how to build ground up, how to do repairs for themselves, how to do repairs for others. Ideally, the fruit of that design studio has an actionable step in that we can train people how to actually literally carry that out into the community.
Yeah, it seems like in this context, there is no difference between design and implementation. In fact, I'm sure there's some theoretical underpinning why you do something, but they all need to be intertwined. Exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
I must ask a few things about the community engagement and community-driven projects. Do you experience NIMBYism in shelters?
Oh man, that's interesting. So ask more. Go further.
Or, I mean, I just it's like a half joke question, but I wonder if that kind of tendencies also appear when listening to communities about if you're trying to deploy another refugee camp next to somewhere that's already established. Do you experience any pushback from the existing community? And also maybe a related question is, what are the, top kind of repeated concerns or questions that you get from the community?
Yeah, so we're not involved at all in the establishment of the camps. So we're coming in after they're there. In Uganda, they have what are called integrated settlements, which is a fancy way of saying there are also Ugandans who live there. So I guess to try to touch the NIMBYism question, there's peaceful coexistence there, and there's also a lot of issues that can come up. When you see refugees harvesting your grass. There's been quite a lot of violent conflict between the community. They're cutting down your tree and your property because they need firewood or they need to build a home. And so there are definitely like some pain points there with that, and some resentments. It's 86% of refugees live in developing countries. And so there can definitely be resentment between people who are also people deserving of some assistance. Seeing refugees, somebody who's not a citizen of that country coming in and seeming like they're getting a good deal, right? So yeah, there's definitely some conflict. I'll take your NIMBY question. I'll say there's definitely conflict between host population and refugees. It's pretty normal. Sometimes it feels and sounds a lot like the migration conversation in the United States. They're taking our jobs because they're willing to work cheaper, or those kind of things. I mean, when I consume media in a lot of these countries, the conversation sounds a lot similar to our migration conversation here. You asked another question, which was like some of the top concerns. It's that my roof leaks. It's that I get bugs in my house. A lot. I think you probably could assume some things about. It's just the quality of what they can afford. In Uganda, refugees will get about $71 to their name ever for anything that's not food related. That is not even a lot of money in that context. And so, a lot of our work involving refugees in the process of constructing the best thing, because honestly, there's no way to solve this with money. They have to be involved with that creation process. So you see varying levels of quality based on a family's ability and means in their home that they end up with.
We covered a lot of breadth, I think, in terms of all the different things that go into deploying a successful solution for refugees. And Scott, as designer and now as CEO, you've grown this whole organization. You must have touched also a lot of jobs. What are some things that you want to do more of, and what are some things that you wish you could do less of?
Yeah. And so we have a woman on our team named Phyllis, and she's an architect, and she's our full-time architect in this context. And I'm regularly jealous of what she gets to do every day. Her job is really to oversee and make all this stuff happen with a team, a great team with her. We've got a great woman who runs the office and does a lot of the administrative and, let's say, cultural translation. As Westerners working in an East African country, she keeps everything kind of together. So yeah, to answer your question, I wish that I had more capacity and time to be more focused on our program. The more that we've grown our team, the more I've been able to start to devote more and more of my time back to that. But yeah, man, I mean, there's, if you count our store employees, we've got over 20 something people at every shelter. And, there's HR and there's payroll and there's bank stuff and there's kind of all the things that go into running an organization. We've started growing our staff on the kind of administrative side. I would love to talk to my bank never again. I'd love to never reconcile a budget at the end of the month and have somebody else doing that. I thought going into this that I wouldn't like fundraising. I like fundraising, for the most part. It's just telling people about this. I love doing that. I love bringing awareness to displaced populations and why you should care about it. And that's 90% of what fundraising is just like, man, I'm really passionate about this. I think we do really good work. It takes money. We live in a really affluent society, and it's really beautiful when somebody has that kind of philanthropic mindset and says like, hey, I don't have that ability, I don't have those skills, but I do have this capital, and you have to have both things to do this work. And so, yeah, I thought I wouldn't like fundraising. I don't mind it because it's mostly just I get to talk about stuff that I think is fun to talk about and I love talking about.
We can tell that you're really passionate about this story and you're really passionate about what you do. Do you find that people are mostly receptive at these fundraising events when you get to tell the story?
Yeah, I do. I think that, there's a lot of other issues living in the United States that are more visible to people, right? So displacement is something that is not visible, and people probably hold a lot of misconceptions. When I say the word refugee, the thing that they're not probably picturing is what the actual conditions are for the majority of refugees. They're thinking migration, they're thinking resettlement. They're not thinking about the 99.9% of refugees who are literally probably within 10 miles of the country they fled from, So, we spend a lot of time kind of reframing people's view of what a refugee is. It's something that they can't demonize. They don't have preconceived notions once they actually understand, what the vast majority of what it means to be a refugee is. And then we just get to share about the work that we do. And we try to do it from a more optimistic point of view. I think I spent probably the first part of this podcast rattling off a lot of frustrating things, but yeah, I do find that people are receptive. I love to convert people, I guess. I love, people don't usually come into not knowing about every shelter having a passion for refugees, but I love bringing exposure to it and bringing people to be passionate about this work.
We're in a housing crisis right now in the developed world, but obviously there's a lot of pain points in the developing world and in the refugee context, which you've been working on for the past decade. I had somebody reach out to me yesterday, actually, and basically say, look, I'm trying to build something, but it's so hard. Like, I'm trying to get my own product off the ground, and there's so many walls, there's so much friction to getting things built. And I've subscribed to the philosophy, at least in this moment, that we kind of know how to do these things. Like, the technology is there, the products are there. It's just like, how do we implement them? And a lot of, I think, the architects and designers or anybody dealing with the built environment who has more of an entrepreneurial streak, their main challenge is figuring out the system, getting things going, and then mobilizing resources within that system. But I think regardless of how intelligent or how savvy you are, there is an incredible amount of grit and perseverance that's involved in that. So I just want to take a moment, Scott, to ask you that question. Over the past 10 years, the past decade you've been working on this, how have you gotten from idea to building? How have you propelled yourself to make sure that you can actually do this?
Yeah. And perseverance, grit. I think it's like maybe the same way a lot of entrepreneurs would answer it. Because, there's been a lot of stuff that's been really hard and it's been really frustrating. And I've hid out in refugee shelters as ISIS and Hezbollah were shooting at each other about 100 yards away. And,
Oh,
we've had a
wow.
lot of disappointment. We've had a lot of disappointment with, funding and partnerships and kind of geopolitics. And it's like, for me, if you spend time in a refugee camp, you don't want to stop. You want to figure it out. It becomes, kind of like a need that you have. It's just like, man, I can't stop doing this. I gotta keep going until I figure it out. And so I think that gave us, I guess just that passion gave us kind of the resolve to kind of get through all the stuff that has been really hard, over the last 10 years of getting this started. And I mean, I would say there's a version of that with every entrepreneur in general. It's like, there's no easy path to building something that means something. Building a business, building, even, buildings, there's no easy path to it. And if you're not you don't have the gut for it, you're probably not going to do it.
Yeah. But what's your kick? What's your reward? How do you refresh and regain the strength? Because perseverance is difficult.
It is. I'm a Christian, and a lot of my faith has a lot to do with like how I recharge. The environment that we work in is really challenging, and I texted my wife. I was in a camp in January in what you call a new arrival field. So it's like all these people coming in. I just texted her at the end of the day. I was like, man, some days my job is really hard, and it's hard to see that many people, right? And I was in Turkey after the earthquake, serving a lot of Syrians in that area, and we were doing a lot of floors there, and just like seeing that level of destruction is really hard. So, for me, the answer is my faith. I'm not sure how other people recharge that work in this space. It's, there's a greater hope, I guess, for me.
I think the three of us definitely do not face as much challenges as we do in our everyday work as you do, especially me, of course. But I think what you have done really successfully is you've not only taken a product all the way to the end, but you have also navigated this incredibly complex system that have just thrown headwind at you. So if you were given the opportunity to change a system, turn those headwinds into tailwinds, what would you change, and how would that help you deliver better solutions for refugees?
Yeah, there's a lot of academics that we love a lot. There's a guy named Alexander Betts. One of our board members is a woman named Dr. Evan Easton Calabria. These are both academics that write a lot about like, hey, man, if you were to remake this thing, how would you do it? And we ascribe to a lot of that. What ends up happening in the refugee space is just all this investment in temporary. So the Assad regime fell in Syria in December. That started in 2011, and it's not over, right? But if we take a moment and reflect on kind of 2011 to 2025, almost $1 trillion of aid was spent assisting Syrian refugees, right? What could we build with that, right? If we had some sort of massive imagination and we said, hey, look, instead of these temporary 1 year at a time, Band-Aids, we can build cities with that kind of money. I don't know how to navigate the politics of all that. I've got lots of kooky ideas that I probably shouldn't say in public spaces around creating safe zones so that people don't have to cross borders. But if you were able to kind of corral all that money that goes into these temporary fixes, hosting refugees in places where they're not wanted, and we can create safe zones in the countries where they're from, and you could take that investment and you could build something really substantial. You could invite the factories in, that can't operate in the other part of the country, and you could say, hey, this is safe. We'll give you grants to restart your factories. Refugees suffer largely because of a lack of opportunity to work, ability to work, right? And so there's some cool things that have happened around the globe. Alexander Betts, it's crazy. It's got to be one of the most influential TED Talks that's ever happened. He gave a TED Talk about pairing outside investment with job opportunities for refugees. And then the next thing you know, there's a free zone in Jordan where refugees are the labor force for it. I think we need people with bigger imaginations. Honestly, I think that maybe that's the easiest way to say it is we need to think about this in a different way. We have to accept that refugees are displaced for decades. And when you think they're not, if you accept that they're, displaced for decades, you approach the problem differently. If you think they're displaced for, a couple months or years, you approach it in the way that we approach it now. There's a reason why the average is starting to get closer and closer to 26 years of displacement. And it's the elephant in the room. If we accept that reality, that duration, we design a different system.
Well, there is a long way to go, obviously, but the current administration, I can't help to just think that, it's making a huge disruption to what you're doing almost directly.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that, the impacts of the recent cancellations on the USAID's grants and all
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I mean, just putting it in practical terms, our primary partner had to lay off about 70% of their workforce in our country, right? So just immediately, once the funding cuts hit, we had to completely reorganize the way that we worked. I'm just talking about from kind of a selfish every shelter standpoint. We shared a lot of resources with them, transportation, HR. Now all of a sudden those things are gone. So for us, we had to completely reorganize the way that we work. It led us to some really beautiful things. We now have partnerships, stronger, deeper partnerships with refugee-led organizations. It's something that we had wanted to do. We're sort of forced into it. And now I think our whole team is just like, man, this is great. We should have done this all along. That's the optimistic, positive way of saying it. But there's a lot of critical things that are not happening now because that aid's not flowing. I could spend an hour talking about all the faults that I see within the USAID funding infrastructure. I'll take my opportunity to talk about this. There's cholera outbreaks in the camp now because there's a lot of refugees coming in. We know how to solve that problem. You build pit latrines, lots of them, enough, right? You hand washing, clean water. We know how to prevent cholera, but the funding has been cut off and there's not what are called WASH services, water access, sanitation, and hygiene. They're cutting off the food aid in the camps where we work in May. People are going to starve to death. So I could, I've had too many conversations with people where they're talking about, trans operas in Ireland and how we have to get rid of USAID. And it's just like, dude, like that is not, like that's a straw man, right? There's lots of bad things that happen within that system, but there's also really important things that happen, AIDS treatment for kids in Africa, through PEPFAR and, the food aid that's getting cut off now. So it's, there could have been reform. There could have been more surgical cuts. If an administration comes in, they don't like something, they could cut those things out. That's their prerogative. I wish that they had taken 10 days and said, hey, what are the things where if we cut this off, people die next week? I wish they had done that at the very least. So some of that's turned back on. Uganda, it turns out, for whatever reason, isn't a priority country. And so the World Food Program is having to pull out, basically. And so it's going to lead to a lot of bad things, where we work.
It's very tough. And I think hopefully one positive out of this is people might understand the impact of helping and assisting, and especially America's role in that. I mean, I keep on thinking back to your original story about when you went to Nigeria and you asked the fundamental question, why do people live like that when I live like this? So for those of our audience out there who want to get into this line of work, or if they want to volunteer, if they just want to get involved in helping transient populations, either abroad or at home, what would you suggest in terms of first course of action or where to look? Yeah,
man, it's a tough environment to introduce people into. I already mentioned kind of the mass layoffs, so I'm not having a pretty optimistic, answer to your question at the moment. I'd say projecting for the future, part of this design studio for us, every shelter, is that we want to create a pipeline for people who actually want to serve in this way and like volunteer in this capacity to have an outlet. Because it took us a long time to get our own access, right? But there's a lot of massively talented people, way more talented than I am, who I'd love to stick in a refugee camp or a settlement and lead a design studio. So I mean, at some point we'll have 4 architects as of this summer. We'll keep growing, but I hope that we're building volunteer opportunities for people to actually come and serve for 3 months at a time in this context. At home, I mean, there's lots of really cool organizations. Like in Houston, there's Houston Welcomes Refugees. There's organizations in every city that come alongside the resettlement services and try to, befriend refugees, try to, acclimate them to life here, the peculiarities of living here. Unfortunately, that's the other casualty. This administration is, we're resettling now 0 refugees, and we're actually getting rid of people's legal refugee status and creating Ukrainian refugees. So it's, I don't know how you describe that besides mean. I don't know how you justify, especially like a Ukrainian refugee who's here right now, how you get rid of their status. But I'll say just for a moment, there's 122 million refugees in the world. At our peak, we were settling in the West, the global West, 85,000. It's a drop in the bucket. That's not the large scale answer. That's like 0.00 something 1% of all the refugees in the world. And so resettlement is amazing for the people that happens to. We're really focused on what life is like for 99.9% of people.
Look, there's not a lot we can control with regards to the way government functions and administration. But if things do get back on track and we move towards more funding and more opportunity, where would you like to see every shelter moving towards? Are there certain products or ideas that you want to pursue? Are there certain avenues or maybe geographies that you want to get into?
Yeah, I mean, this is a terrible analogy, and I'm going to try it out on you guys first. But I don't know if you guys know what the Enigma machine is. The Turing, the Germans were communicating in encrypted language, and Alan Turing was going to build a machine that was not just solving it one day at a time, but solving it every single time. I have that vision for that at every shelter. It's like, hey, we can't solve, like, it's inappropriate to think that you can solve all the problems in every refugee context everywhere in the world, but can we design the right systems that can be inserted into these things and solved? That's sort of maybe my really grand vision. It's just like, man, let's build a machine that can solve the problems if you insert it into that context. So we know that we'll be in more countries. We're pretty happy to be, we feel just at our current size, pretty content to be in Uganda for at least the next 3 years only. But we do know that we probably will likely be in other geographies, at some point. So don't know what those are. Yeah, don't know what those are yet. We feel pretty resolved to spend the next 3 years in Uganda, like getting it right or getting it right enough, so that when we do go to another place, we're like, hey, this is the game plan. Here's the playbook. Here's how we're going to do this. So
before we get to our final question, if I'm a listener right now, I listen to you, Scott, tell this story, and I have time, I have resources, and I want to come support you. Maybe I want to come volunteer. Maybe I want to help you or just follow your work. Where should I go?
Yeah, we have all the social medias, or I don't know. We probably don't. I know we have Instagram and Facebook. Our website is everyshelter.org. If you're local to Houston, we have events pretty regularly. We love hosting really small, intimate events where we curate really great, informative content. So yeah, social media, our website, you can sign up for our newsletter. If you go to everyshelter.org, the first thing you see when you go there is a donate widget. We put that there on purpose because we would love your help. We want that to be the first thing you see. And so everyshelter.org, you'll see the donation button. You'll also see places where you can sign up to get our newsletter. We've got, if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you can see a lot of the booklets that we publish. When we kind of take a deep dive into one subject, we like to publish a booklet. It is self-published. I don't think anybody wants to publish them for us, but if you're listening and want to, let us know. But we like to, we do that because we would be very happy if another nonprofit somewhere else serving refugees in the world took exactly what we did and they did the same thing. That would be great. But that, especially for the architects that are listening, some of those booklets might be fun to look through.
So that brings us to our final question, the one we always love to ask all of our guests. And I think, Scott, you probably will bring a very unique perspective. Part of the reason why we do this podcast, part of the reason why it's called Most Podern, is we're all here trying to figure out what era we're in. So we pose the question to you, Scott. How would you define the era that we're currently in?
Man, it is so hard. I mean, to answer that question, we have so many inputs. Like, we have historically more inputs than we've ever had. You go back 100 years, like, you probably knew your neighbors within a mile radius, and then the newspaper, and then TV. And now, like, these things are like constantly with us, and we're just getting news alerts and messages, and we know everything that's happening in the world. And so, like, as somebody running a nonprofit, it's like, man, we recognize that people have cause overload. There's so many things to care about. So a clever person could give a name to it. I think that we still haven't reconciled with the fact that we have too many inputs in our life, and we don't know how to synthesize it. We don't know how to act. Running a nonprofit, raising money, knowing that there's a lot of really great things to care about in the world, we just try to keep it simple and just say, like, we would love it if you cared about this and did this alongside of us. And so maybe we're in the input over input era. I don't know. But yeah, it wears on us, man. Yeah, there's too many things in our brains.
Well, it's a moment of extreme complexity, but I think your story shows us that sometimes simple responses to that complexity are the most powerful.
I tell people that a lot. I was like, hey, maybe this isn't your cause, but you can make that choice. You can care about this, and there's something you can do about it. And so I do try to keep it simple, with fundraising and just in general. It's like, man, you can do something. You shouldn't do nothing. You should do something. Refugees may not be your cause, but there is something that you should care about, and you should put yourself into that.
That's incredibly profound.
Thanks.
Okay, now it makes me feel bad that I'm about to end this with, if you're listening to this on YouTube or Spotify or Apple, please give us a like and subscribe. It really helps us find more guests like Scott. And, to our listeners, we thank you for letting us be one more input in your life, and we hope you'll enjoy this episode.
Most Podern.
Most Podern.
Most Podern.
Most Podern. Most Podern 팟캐스트.